let's talk about what causes inflation. And that is actually a more complex answer than actually describing what exactly inflation is. So we're going to start with a UK economist from the 1950s, 1960s, A.W. Phillips. He came out with this theory, this Phillips Curve, that basically said there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Basically, if inflation was rising, unemployment was falling. So the idea is if you get unemployment to rise, that would lower inflation. Now, that held true in the 1950s and 1960s. That completely fell apart in the 1970s. Stagflation in the 1970s, when unemployment was rising and inflation was rising at the same time, that would buck the trend of what the Phillips curve was showing from historical data. Now, there is some truth to the Phillips curve. It's just not the truth. It doesn't explain everything. There's other factors besides just unemployment that influence inflation. Now let's talk the quantity theory of money. That sounds like a fancy term, but basically it means the more money you put into the economy, the more likely you're going to experience inflation. If the money supply grows too big relative to the size of the economy, unit value of the currency diminishes, meaning inflation. The more money in the economy, the purchasing power will fall. There's more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. Prices will rise, and that is the key ingredient for inflation. So how exactly does more money end up in the economy? We're starting with a set amount of dollars. How do more dollars end up in the economy? Well, that is from expansionary policies such as lower interest rates. You can borrow money, businesses borrow money, the government borrows money. That's putting more dollars in the economy. And government spending. So if government spending increases, that is putting more dollars, is putting more demand in the economy. And the more dollars, the more demand that's in the economy with the same amount of goods and services, you're going to experience inflation. So what we just described is demand pull inflation. Let's talk about supply pull inflation. These are supply shocks. This is when you might have a natural disaster, a hurricane, disrupts production of a certain good or a certain service. Because the supply is low now, that can also cause inflation. With low supplies within the same amount of demand, prices will rise. Now, another supply shock is the cost of production rises unexpectedly. And the primary example that I have for here is oil prices. If oil prices rise, that influences so many different items, products, services, that could unexpectedly cause inflation because of the rise of oil price, gasoline prices, etc. Shipping becomes more expensive, filling your car becomes more expensive. There's a lot of impact from oil prices, and that is a supply shock that can happen in the economy. Our next influence on inflation is the Federal Reserve itself. They set, as we discussed, they set monetary policies to monitor and try to control inflation. The Federal Reserve wants to maintain a 2% target on inflation. So if inflation is getting hot, they're going to influence the market. If inflation looks low or stable, they're going to try to influence growth. Now, they use three primary tools to do this. One is going to be the discount rate. This is the interest rate the Federal Reserve lends money to banks. This is also going to be through controlling the bank reserve requirements. If banks need to hold more money in their reserves, they're going to have less to lend out. They can control the money supply to a certain extent from a bank perspective, how much banks can lend. And what also they do from a money supply perspective is open market operations. Federal Reserve will buy and sell bonds and other assets in order to impact the money supply and the short-term interest rates in the economy. There are the three tools the Federal Reserve is using to influence inflation, either to contract or grow the economy. And my last influence on inflation, and this is not a comprehensive, there's a lot of factors that influence inflation. These are just the primary ones that I'm covering in this video, but expectations, this is psychological. If people or businesses are anticipating higher costs, they're going to build those higher costs into contracts, wage negotiations. Best scenario that I can give here is rent increases. If you've ever signed a lease, you will notice there's a lot of times there's a 3-5% rent escalator depending where you live. But that is inflation. You're building inflation into the contract. The rent is expected to go up 3%, 5% every year. That means the cost of housing is going up 3 and 5% every year. And if you don't get a raise, if you don't increase the amount of money that you're bringing home, your cost of living is going down over time. So that is a simple example of expectations that are built into contracts, built into wage negotiations, that causes inflation. These expectations that we are setting with each other through our interactions. But if you were to summarize this in just one key idea of what causes inflation, basically there is too much demand relative to the supply, and most likely there's too many dollars chasing too few goods, and that is the primary reason for inflation. Now, clear, it's more complex than that, but if you boil it down into just one key idea, too many dollars chasing too few goods. Now, the economy is complex. There is a lot of factors that play into inflation and what happens with the consumer price index. Now, inflation by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Stable, low, predictable inflation is great and healthy for economy. And it sets proper expectations within that economy when you have contracts and interactions between individuals, businesses. If they can expect 2-3% inflation, they're going to be better at predicting prices and offering wages. The economy is going to run much smoother in that type of environment. If you have bouts of large inflation increases, that's where the predictability and expectations can go off the rails and you can run into some trouble. And a really extreme example would have been in the 1970s with stagflation. But I hope you learned something from this video. Have a great rest of the day, and I will see you in the next one. Take care and goodbye. Yeah.